No, absolutely. I think we are ensuring that they have the necessary supplies and access to testing. And we've so far provided over $3 million, and will continue to provide support to the community as is needed.
1 minute, Gary. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears quickly, Minister. I'm also hearing today from another First Nation, not in my riding, but very just on the edge of my riding, the James Smith Cree Nation, where they're having a bit of an outbreak. They're locking down their communities. And I talked to the chief today, and he expressed a very significant level of frustration with just his interaction with the department. He expressed a concern about not getting answers to questions and not being engaged. I mean, I quote, we have not had any meaningful response or dialogue to protect our community. Can you maybe just explain in the time you have left why this chief would feel he has such a frustration and a lack of response?
Briefly.
It's very hard to speculate on precisely the concern without speaking. We've had a number of conversations organized by Federation FSIN with the chief in question. We do have numerous amounts of medical purpose PPE that have been sent into the community to assist them with their needs, and we will assist them throughout this in their lockdown. We've had a number of exchanges of letters about they've had a Canada-wide request to distribute PPE. It is a complex matter of significant financial proportions. It would exceed what their community has requested for their own purposes and needs. It's an initiative that we are looking at and continue to look at internally, but it is something that I will do with the chief in question.
Thanks very much, Minister. Mr. Pawlowski, it's your turn, and you have 6 minutes for your questioning.
Thank you. No, a lot of the supplementary estimates money is going to the COVID response. So far in Northwestern Ontario, there hasn't been any substantial number of cases in the Indigenous community, but I think it's pretty well inevitable that that's going to change, in that we seem to be in the process of an outbreak at the moment here. I think we've had something like 100 cases in the last week, whereas we were getting like 1 or 2 cases per week up until then. So certainly there's a concern that it's going to spread from here to First Nations communities. Many of them, and Mr. Malilo's riding up there, Nan communities, but Thunder Bay is the conduit. People fly from Thunder Bay up to those communities. A lot of the medical services are in Thunder Bay, so whatever the reason people come down from Thunder Bay to Thunder Bay, if they get it and go back to those communities, there's certainly a concern. Now, one of the questions, and you're probably not going to be able to answer this question because it's a bit of a medical question, but I found interesting in your numbers was, I think you said so far in First Nations communities, there's been 28 deaths, and I think you said over 1,700 cases, which is, I think, somewhat reassuring, because there was a concern that in the Indigenous communities, the death rate would be above the national average, given probably, well, especially based on the fact that with H1N1 and influenza, it seemed to particularly hit hard those communities with higher rates of mortality. Do we know from the experience so far, is the mortality rate higher in the Indigenous community than the non-Indigenous community? That was the first question. Is there an answer to that one? Because then my second question was going to be, what have we done in order to try to protect those communities? They have largely shut down, but the risk has certainly gone up as of the last couple of weeks. Thanks.
Well, Marcus, thanks, and members will note that a Liberal member has posed the question that he knows I can't answer with the proper expertise. But I think during this pandemic, those of us that are called upon to act quickly have all become armchair epidemiologists and have been diving into some of the numbers. What we do see when we look at comparables in the U.S. is Indigenous communities being hit 3.5 to 5 times more, if you look at Alaska, than the already soaring rates that exist in the U.S. And if you look at the numbers with respect to the first wave, much lower in comparison to non-Indigenous Canadians. It's not really something that we look at in order to pat ourselves on the back, because particularly when we look at how severely the second wave is hitting, still under the national non-Indigenous averages, But what we are seeing is really, really dangerous trends, Marcus, and they are alarming in a number of ways. One, we know the leadership and work that's been done in Indigenous communities, most notably on reserve, to shut down, to take these things serious. Indigenous people have faced historic epidemics over time. That is, the tuberculosis is not only present, but is still fresh in their minds for those communities that have been hit in the recent past. And when it comes to the Inuit, still have rates that are 300 times the national average, 60 times in First Nations communities. Pulmonary disease, very much the same symptoms and the same comorbidities that exist. Overcrowding in housing has been a source of that. These things aren't going away because of the pandemic, and that risk still remains. And the alarming numbers that I see are now in urban areas in Manitoba, where you see higher rates of hospitalization, higher rates of people in intensive care that are Indigenous. That is the very alarming to me, and it challenges the borders of our effective capacity of execution in our jurisdiction at Indigenous Services Canada. That is to help the urban populations that are hit harder. Now, there are things that have been done well. Communities have stepped up. We've supported them with funds and health. The best we know about COVID as it's developing, but we're not out of the woods yet, and there is no magic to keeping COVID out of the community. And when people let their guard down, mostly at emotional events like funerals and weddings or large social gatherings, COVID will hit. It'll hit hard, and it'll affect Indigenous populations in a disproportionate fashion.
I have to say, Minister, for someone who's not a doctor, you did a very excellent job, far better than I would have managed. So how about the second part as to the preparation for those NAN communities?
We work with NAN and Grand Chief Fiddler in particular. We know the challenges that those NAN communities face. The one that will probably be raised with respect to water advisories. Also a number of, if we look at it with the wellness indexes that we track across Indigenous Services Canada through the wellness survey, we know that those communities are disproportionate, face a number of disproportionate inequalities. Not every community is the same, but it is sort of the cards that we've had to deal with going into this. I would also note that hidden pandemic with respect to mental health, and NAN has some really incredible initiatives that deal with that. But they have also, if you look at some of the mortalities that have occurred in that area, more have occurred with respect to suicide than have with respect to COVID. So there are challenges that remain, but it starts and ends with the cooperation through, first and foremost, local leadership, but also regional organizations, and in this case, as you named, NAN.
Right on time. Thank you very much. Madame Bérubé, bonsoir. Vous avez la parole. 6 minutes.
Mrs. Bérubé, 6 minutes. Thank you. My question is for Minister Miller. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, measures have been adopted necessary to reduce the crisis. In Gaspé and such as other communities in a situation like this, they were in the dead zone for support programs. It hasn't changed. Do you think that you should adopt the programs to better respond to the needs of all the communities in a fair manner for all Indigenous peoples? Thank you, Mrs. Bérubé. This is another part of the puzzle that I referred to when I was talking about Indigenous communities, urban Indigenous communities, if you'd like. What we should note is with regards to the Gaspé breed, whether it be conventional or unconventional community, the point is the same. Adequate healthcare services, first-class healthcare services that have been denied for Indigenous peoples before the pandemic, and we are dealing with this, and we have to make sure that COVID does not enter into this community. Yes, there's also another simple way to save Indigenous communities. It costs a lot for the government. We have to make sure that the communities and businesses are able to benefit from public contracts to their to get their fair share of public contracts. What are you doing so that they will obtain public contracts? You're referring to this implicitly, but we did, if I'm not wrong, during the speech from the throne in 2019, we had this principle of saying that we would reach 5% If it's not in the speech from the throne, I believe it's in the mandate letters of Mrs. Annan. I have a meeting with her and the Minister Duclos in the days to come to see how we can make sure that we do exactly that, what you're saying. Our job on the federal level have their fair share. That is 5% of contracts from the federal government. It's not the case right now. It's very unequal. And this is something that we have to fight for in all departments, not only for this Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. You spoke earlier about cases throughout Canada, and in Nunavik, we know that there's a huge increase. It started with 2, I think we're at 29 cases now. What are you doing? Do you have alerts? Do people have the necessary resources to avoid a very serious second wave? We're continuing with our commitment. Today, I spoke with Nathan Obed. We spoke about specific needs for the Inuit, and this includes Indigenous peoples in Nunavik, and we have a meeting with regards to financial resources tomorrow to deal with Nunavut, as you indicated, and we've seen in the news, they're seeing a very large outbreak. I said earlier in my speech, 70 positive cases identified, and this will probably go up. So we have to have a close relationship with regards to our relationship for Nunavik, medical resources, financial resources in Nunavik or in Nunavik. You do have a good cooperation, I think, with the leaders of the Indigenous communities in Northern Quebec. Yes, we have a very good relationship. With regards to territorial arrangements, yes. We can always improve our relationship. It does simplify feedback and the deployment of resources, but I hope that I'm not too forward to say that the relationship is a very good one. Do I have time left? 1 minute? All right. So I'd like to come back to Nunavik because we know that with the pandemic right now, development continues with regards to the support to the aviation industry or roads during the winter. Well, winter is very close, and so what can you do to avoid a catastrophe with the new wave of outbreaks? This is a very relevant question, and it's relevant throughout Canada. We're talking about air carrier service in isolated areas. And when we talk about Nunavik, we need a relationship with Quebec to ensure air travel for these territories that are affected. Same with Newfoundland. Since the beginning, we've made sure that there is air carrier service. This is part of essential services, especially for medical services, but we do have a very strong need for air carriers. They're quite in a precarious situation right now. I do have figures on this.
Moving on to Ms. Blaney now, and we'll perhaps pick up those numbers later, Minister. Ms. Blaney, 6 minutes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank you, Minister, and your team for being here with us this evening. The first question that I have for you, Minister, is yesterday in response to the question that I asked in question period about systemic racism in healthcare, the Prime Minister said that your government is working on Indigenous healthcare legislation, and he believes that this will assist with this. I'm just wondering, when can we look forward to seeing this legislation?
Well, thank you, MP Blaney. And first, I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate you on your appointment, as well as the recent briefing with my team on C92, which I know is near and dear to everyone's heart on this committee. The health this is an exceedingly difficult topic, and particularly since what we've seen in the last month or so with respect to Indigenous people, which, while a shock to non-Indigenous people in Canada, was not shocking, but a repeating pattern of a lived experience of Indigenous people being treated badly, poorly, subject to systemic racism across the healthcare system. It was something that, as you well will remember, was announced in the speech from the throne, and COVID, again, like many things, has just exacerbated this lived reality. In terms of putting forward healthcare legislation, this is something that we have to do with the proper consultation with Indigenous communities. So I've asked my team, conscious of the fact that we are operating in COVID times and have to observe physical distancing for people's health and well-being, to take the time to do the proper consultation with Indigenous partners, treaty areas, a number of them, just in a number of the reports. The one that comes to mind, obviously, is the Van report. These are issues that are intermingled with jurisdictional challenges. The federal government has its role to play. It's unquestionable. But this is something that we will need to do not only in partnership with Indigenous peoples first and foremost, but in partnership with the provinces.
Okay, so not a really clear timeline, but working on it. So my next question to you is, the Connected Coast project aims to bring fiber optic internet to the entire Canadian West Coast, including dozens of unserved and underserved Indigenous communities. The Universal Broadband Fund will cover 75% off the coast for last mile infrastructure. If the department, depending on treaty or non-treaty, doesn't cover the final 25%, many of these communities will suffer because of it. And the province is planning to cover that 25% for non-Indigenous communities. And to me, that would be another example of systemic racism, for non-Indigenous communities to be covered and Indigenous communities not to be covered. So I'm just wondering if I can get a commitment that the department will cover the 25% to ensure that these communities finally have internet access and can be brought closer to equity.
I thank you again for the question, and just in response to your conclusion before you asked your question on the timing of the legislation, while it perhaps is the prerogative of the federal government when to introduce this type of legislation, it really will be Indigenous communities after our consultation that will guide that timeline. And I think it's just always important to remember, and I know you know that. On the question with respect to broadband, this is a portfolio that does fall under the responsibility of Minister Monsef. I would note that in the announcement by the Prime Minister that there is $100 million that is reserved.
Yeah, so I'm actually talking specifically. So Monsef, I understand that, that's the 75%. The limit is the 25%. The province has already stepped up and said they will fulfill that 25% in partnership with the federal government to make sure that non-Indigenous communities get the internet accessibility. So what I'm asking is, will this department acknowledge that they need to work with the Indigenous communities to make sure that that 25% gap is covered?
I agree with you when I say we have to work with Indigenous communities to identify their broadband needs and prioritize them when they are identified as priorities. Absolutely.
But no commitment to actually supporting to make sure that they get that final one, or even looking into it, would be so helpful to the many Indigenous communities that I serve in my riding.
Well, absolutely glad to look into. These are issues that are raised constantly, and as I mentioned earlier, with respect to healthcare legislation exacerbated by COVID, as students in particular are asked to study at home, and it isn't a function necessarily of remoteness, although that does.
Well, and I can tell you that in one community in particular in my riding, it was a matter of meters. But because Indigenous services would not step up to pick that up, that meant the community bordering the Indigenous community got the internet accessibility, and the reserve that was just right there across the bridge did not get it. So this is the challenge, and I'm hoping that your department will look into it, because if this is not addressed, it means Indigenous communities across this region will not get the accessibility while all the communities around them do get the accessibility. And to me, that is another explicit example of systems failing Indigenous people, which is systemic racism. My time is done.
Thanks very much, Ms. Blaney, and right on time too. Mr. Viersen, I think I see you down there around the table, and you have 5 minutes for your first round of questioning.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here today. I appreciate it. I don't quite know where he's at right now, but it's a little weird to talk to an empty room. Well, he's not here. We've seen across this country, we've seen First Nation communities step up to deal with COVID, but there's a number of other issues that are being dealt with across the country. In particular, I'm thinking about the Mi'kmaq fishermen and the non-Indigenous fishermen. About a month ago, you made some comments about the RCMP letting down the New Brunswickers. I'm just wondering if you could clarify that a little bit.
You'd have to clarify your question, MP Viersen. My comment about letting the RCMP letting down Indigenous communities, it wasn't about New Brunswick.
Nova Scotia?
Yes, it was about communities in Nova Scotia, and particularly the assault on Chief Sack and the 2 days later, the burning of a fish plant. I think what everyone saw and what Indigenous communities have seen time and time again is police services failing to serve them. And if you look at the statistics, and I would direct everyone to the report by former Justice Bastarash that came out today. I think that is quite clear insofar as it relates to Indigenous people.
I would say, though, Mr. Minister, that the government has let down all of Nova Scotians around this issue. This issue has been escalating for months, and I'm concerned that the government has failed to step in. Around the policing aspect of it, are you the minister that's responsible for policing?
I am not.
Have you spoken to the minister who is responsible for policing?
I have.
Do you have a plan to ensure that the RCMP don't let down Nova Scotianers again?
Again, my comments were made in relation to Indigenous peoples feeling let down by...
Point of order, Chair.
Yes,
Point
go
of
ahead.
order.
Go ahead.
Is the minister not here on supplementary estimates? This is not something that's in estimates, and I'm just wondering.
I'll be getting to it shortly.
But you're
Okay.
not right now.
Okay, we'll
Chair?
take that as advice. Yeah. Do I have another point of order? No, please go ahead,
just the
Mr.
one.
Viersen. Arnold, you have 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Was it my answer or his question? Chair?
My question is, has he spoken to the minister responsible for policing, and have they come up with a plan?
The answer is yes, and obviously I will not disclose cabinet confidences, but I would point the member to the speech from the throne, which I am sure he's read, and the 4 or 5 points dealing with policing therein.
Right. Is there any requirement for your ministry to help fund? Policing is considered a service across this country. Is there any requirement, or will there be any proposals for your ministry to help fund this?
Actually, I do appreciate that question, because the Indigenous Services Canada does have that relationship with Indigenous communities, and we obviously hear it from community members and leadership with respect to the need for policing as an essential service. I've had numerous occasions, including today, with partners from Treaty 7 wanting to be engaged in the consultation in and around police reform, not only with respect to policing as an essential service. And I think when you say essential service for policing in Indigenous communities, we should all reflect on the fact that we take our own policing services in non-Indigenous communities as for granted where it isn't granted to Indigenous communities. It is a reflection of where we are as a country. But the answer, MP Viersen, is absolutely yes. We can also examine with Indigenous communities, as well as Minister Blair and his team, alternatives to policing, particularly when it comes to mental health interventions. I think a lot of the stuff that we've seen at the beginning of the year are areas where it may not be appropriate to have
Mr. Miller, what's
playing the role that they do.
I'm sorry, Arnold, we're out of time.
Oh yeah, you do
5
that to me
minute
every
round.
time. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Well, when your time comes up, I do in fact do it every time. You're right. Mrs. Zann, go ahead, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Minister, for being here and making yourself available to us for all these questions. You know, yesterday I had a really good meeting with CASA, the Canadian Association of the students, and they were telling me about some of the issues that Indigenous students are facing. And in fact, it is true that Indigenous students and youth are another group of people that have been significantly impacted by COVID-19. And I just want to commend them for being so resilient during this crisis. But could you please expand for us on the $15.9 million to support First Nations and Inuit students and youth? And how many students and youth will this help? And what is our government doing to support them during the COVID-19 pandemic? Alan.
And thank you so much for the question. I think as schools were shut down at the very beginning of the pandemic, particularly given the vulnerabilities that I've highlighted earlier on, people were very worried about their children not only getting COVID, but being vectors of spread within the community. So the portrait of Indigenous education across Canada is obviously not one that's limited to the on-reserve reality of schools, yet it is one, and we continue to build schools on reserve where they're requested and needed. To that end, a month ago, the Prime Minister announced as part of the school support packages $112 million that was dedicated to helping kids go back to school as part of a safe return. Now, it should be an unescapable reality that there are enhanced needs with respect to children or communities that have taken the difficult decision to keep their kids at home. Not everyone can be plugged to an iPad or a computer device to do online learning. So some of the supports that we've given, for example, under Jordan's principle, have been precisely to give those supports to Indigenous students where the communities are keeping them at home. But there is that reality that it is stressed really the mental health of children. And so a lot of the supports and the stress that we see on some of the funding that with respect to which the estimates touch deal with that reality. It is a bleak one at times, but we're there obviously to help. And wherever communities see that need, we do our best to step in. MP Blaney did raise that issue with respect to connectivity, and it isn't the reality of necessarily remote communities. That is the reality, for example, in city service and quality education to which Indigenous children are entitled. It is not one that we've overcome completely yet, but we're working towards it. We also have invested, as of October 30, about $200 million in additional funding to provide education-related supports to Indigenous peoples in community. And when it comes to the 60 or 75 million that was dedicated specifically to Indigenous students, and that's an important aspect of it, coupled with our post-secondary institution supports, which had been suffering up to now, that we announced a few weeks back.
Thank you for that. You know, actually, it was the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations. Sorry about that. Investment in funding for the Child and Family Services. Could you please tell us how this funding will go to supporting the implementation of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal's ruling and what our government is doing to make it?
Go ahead.
Well, thank you for that. And as a result of the rulings that with respect to which we continue to implement the support for children, there's 200 million that is dedicated to supporting children and families. This is something that is an ongoing challenge as we reform our way internally, continue to implement those orders, and we continue to work with the partners that continue to to introduce claims with respect to the CHRT, whether that is within that or within class actions, to assume that we come to a resolution that properly compensates Indigenous children. With respect to the sums in question, they reflect an additional amount that is added to the larger amount of supports to Indigenous children.
Rube again. We have your mic could be bent a little closer to your mouth, Minister Miller. Translation thinks that you are. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Miller, it's been demonstrated that Indigenous businesses are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 if we compare with the rest of businesses in Canada. One of the observations is the government is not calling on these businesses to purchase their goods and services with regards to COVID-19 needs. Thank you. I'll try to speak a little bit louder. That is to say that Indigenous businesses are in a more precarious situation, and there are identified challenges with regards to the capitalization of these businesses. We have invested over $400 million to support local Indigenous tourism. The role of these businesses within communities is sometimes slightly different, especially when band councils are managing businesses, and they sometimes are not for-profit businesses, they're community-based businesses. So there are multiple. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, Indigenous communities do have access to support as announced throughout Canada, but there are specific, there's been no tourism because communities had a blockade, and that was necessary. So how did you help communities given the situation? Supported $16 million specifically to support them during the pandemic.
2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And first of all, I want to thank the Minister for committing to working with my office on this 25% question that I'll have for you this evening is really based on what we heard in committee earlier this week. We were told by Aboriginal Financial Institution and the National Association of Aboriginal 2.5 months for the Indigenous business programs to get set up compared to the non-Indigenous business programs, for example, the CEBA. And in fact, one of their concerns now is that they still don't know CEBA. So the biggest concern for them is that this is an issue of economic justice. Indigenous communities have been working to build economies, as you know, for a very long time. There has been continuous provincial and federal legislation historically that has barred them from being a part of the system. They are now making their way, and there's a lot of success with businesses during that time. So they're just wondering, will the next rollout not be 2.5 months later than everybody else? Thank you.
We're very general, and absolutely there were a number of mistakes were made, and eligibility criteria on a number of fronts. And we saw a number of these prejudiced by and duly prejudiced Indigenous communities. I think our teams worked really hard to work with the Minister of Finance to place private actors in the economy and give those supports that are there. And some of these did, in fact, need to be tailored. Some of the financial instruments that have been distributed, I think we've had about 1,100 loans get out. But there is clearly a timeliness challenge that we faced. And as we fine-tune our response, I don't think...
And we do too.
Okay. Well, Bob, I was going to conclude with something, but... you broke my
save that. I'm sorry for that.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, I want to talk for a few minutes, or what little time I have left here, about vaccines. There is an awful lot of stress and anxiety in these northern and remote communities, as you can imagine. And I know you've been talking to these people and really give them some hope, to really share some optimism, to really give them a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So I guess what I'm asking is, what's the plan for a rollout of vaccine? What's the access going to be in these remote communities as far as a vaccine when that opportunity arises?
Stories about the positive results on 2 vaccines in particular, and the wide suite of access of, in terms of the other vaccines that Canada has. But this has to be distributed in a way that reflects not only those in the healthcare services needing and prioritization to be established with respect to who gets them and when, but also whether we're talking about ensuring that these vaccines are transported to areas and then deployed in an equitable fashion that recognizes the inequalities that we've all talked about on this committee. And certainly our teams, and I see Valerie Gideon on it, are working night and day to ensure that we'll have an approach that reflects not only have learned experience from the H1N1 vaccine and some of the challenges that were faced there. They were surmounted, and in fact, I think testimony has shown that Indigenous communities received a higher rate of vaccinations finally. But there were some challenges at the beginning. We won't want to face those again, but we're very, very aware of them and working not only with local leadership, but with health authorities to ensure that there is a proper deployment of those vaccines in a way that I've described.
Maybe just obviously that's a huge obstacle when we're talking fly-in communities and whatnot. Can either you or maybe one of the officials just flesh that out in a little bit more detail for me? I just want to make sure that we have a plan that we're offering.
Sure, absolutely. So just to be clear that the vaccine will be distributed through provinces and territories, and it will be done in partnership vaccine when it arrives at community, but we're going to be leveraging the same supply chains and the same distribution mechanisms as the provinces and territories will be using for all of their citizens. There is work that level and with expertise that we're able to bring to the table. But I just wanted to reassure you that, we're not going to be treating sort of the Indigenous people's vaccine through a different supply mechanism that might be more vulnerable. We're going to be leveraging the provincial territory supplies and equipment to support the integrity of the vaccine throughout the process.
Less than a minute, Gary.
Thank you. Minister, one last quick question. There's as I know you're aware, there's often a significant level of mistrust with kind of institutions and whatnot from some is there any kind of strategy or planning in the context of making sure that people that have an inherent mistrust of the system, so to speak?
Absolutely, it's key not only to respecting the reality and the lived experience of Indigenous peoples with the medical system, but also the effective deployment of the vaccine. So these are issues that we've been working on internally and with leadership in the last little while. I would say that they remain to be perfected. I think when you speak about hope, I think people should be very hopeful given the results that we've seen, but we also have to maintain vigilance in ensuring that the public health guidelines are followed properly, and that's something that we need to continue to do. But that all has to be delivered and administered and worked with in partnership with First Nations and Indigenous communities.
And I'm sorry that the time has run out for this session. Thank you so much, Minister, and the senior officials for joining us. We're going to suspend for just a couple of minutes while we assemble our next panel with our thank you to all. I call this meeting back to order. As we resume the meeting, the committee is continuing to consider the supplementary estimates, B 2020-21. And once again with us by video conference for this hour, the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Northern Affairs, Dan Vandal, accompanied by Daniel Kwan Watson, the Deputy Minister, Assistant Deputy Minister Serge Baudouin, Acting Senior Assistant Deputy Minister Annie Boudreau, and the Acting Chief Finance, Jean-Francois Talbot. Ms. Bennett, please go ahead for 6 minutes. Welcome to our panel.
Merci. Quay, good evening. Bonsoir. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui depuis mon...
I'm joining you today from my home in Toronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where we honor all of the Indigenous peoples who paddled these waters and whose moccasins are all participating today as we continue to work so hard to keep our families and our communities safe. Mr. Chair, it's always important for me to appear before this committee. I look forward to a discussion on supplementary estimates B for Crown-Indigenous Relations. I'm joined today by Deputy Minister Daniel Kwan Watson, Acting Senior Deputy Minister of Policy and Strategic Direction, Annie Boudreau, Assistant Deputy Minister of Northern Affairs, Serge Baudouin, and the Acting Chief Financial Results and Delivery Officer, Jean-Francois Talbot.
21 supplementary estimates B, reflect filing funding, 138 million in new funding, and 8 million of net transfers with other government departments. So that total budgetary authorities for 2020-2021 will be $6.7 billion. These funds will contribute to our government's ongoing work to advance reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and to support and accelerate First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, realizing their inherent right to self-determination. Acknowledging the limited time for my remarks this evening, I would like to highlight some of the key initiatives outlined in these estimates and look forward to discussing the supplementary estimates B in more detail through your questions. We've also provided the committee with a deck, which I think is helpful in outlining all the initiatives in the supplementary estimates B. I would also like to highlight for the committee that the reprofiling of funds reflected in these estimates is, as I think we've talked about here at the committee before, a common management practice. And as I've noted for the committees in the past, these reprofiles reflect expenditures where timing cannot be easily predicted and ensure funds remain available in future years for their intended purposes. For example, the reprofile of $760.1 million for the specific claim settlement fund requested through these supplementary estimates will preserve the total amount available in that fund for 2020-21 at approximately $1.86 billion. The specific claim settlement fund is the source of funds for compensation for both negotiated settlement agreements and financial awards that are made by the specificity to transfer monies not spent in a particular year to a future year. And so the reprofile of specific claim settlement funding between fiscal years is a normal occurrence that helps ensure the availability of funds needed for settlement compensation in the year in a timely way as soon as the settlement is reached. So supplementary estimates also identify tables represent a new flexible way to affirm the unique rights, needs, and interests that matter most to Indigenous communities. And it acknowledges that different Indigenous communities or groups may want to assert jurisdiction in different areas at their own pace or incrementally. And I'm really proud to report that there are now over 150 active negotiation tables in more than 500 communities and involving almost 1 million Indigenous peoples to support their vision in realizing their vision of self-determination. We know that Indigenous self-determination is the most effective way to support improving health and educational outcomes and unlocking the economic potential in Indigenous communities. Despite the current COVID-19, even been able to sign some agreements virtually. So the 28.6 million requested through these estimates will ensure the continued progress through these important discussions. The supplementary estimates also include requests for funding to support a number of other initiatives, including further progress on the TRC calls to action, the development of a national action plan for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse peoples, in interest payment for the First Nations with loans through the First Nations Finance Authority. That was the relief for that, the ratification of the Anishinaabe Nation Governance Agreement, and to ensure that Canada can resolve outstanding litigation. So I urge the committee to vote in favor. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Minister. And next we have the Honorable Dan Vandal and St. Boniface, apparently, the Minister of Northern Affairs. Dan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairperson. Tansi, bonjour, and greetings. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from my office here in St. Boniface, St. Vital, Treaty 1 territory, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm pleased to answer your questions on Supplementary Estimates B. We also recognize that this is a particularly difficult time for many regions across Canada, as well as we all continue to work together to curb the spread of COVID-19 and keep people healthy and safe across our country. These estimates reflect our government's commitment. That these estimates demonstrate our government's plan to continue working towards renewing the relationship between Canada and Indigenous nations, tackling the impacts of climate change, promoting economic development, and creating jobs for those living in the North and the Arctic. The 2020-2021 supplementary estimates reflects a net increase of approximately $13.4 million in reprofiled funding for Northern Affairs. This funding will primarily support the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, the Canadian High Arctic Research Station program, and research is for everyone is critical, not only for individual success, but for local economies and to our country. Canada's Arctic and Northern residents, and especially Indigenous people, have not had access to the same services, the same opportunities, and the same standard of living as those in the rest of Canada. That's why our government is making substantial investments and working in partnership with Northerners to develop long-term opportunities, building healthier communities, respecting the rights and interests of Indigenous nations, and supporting a sustainable and a dynamic economy to support education in the North and the Arctic. The task force's mandate commits to seeking the perspective of Northerners. It will engage Indigenous partners across the Arctic and the North, including young people, other governments, post-secondary institutions, as well as leaders on how the federal government can improve post-secondary educational opportunities. We need to close the gaps that for the Canadian High Arctic Research Station project that totals $2.4 million. Based out of Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, the Canadian High Arctic Research Station will become the headquarters of Polar Knowledge Canada, which is responsible for advancing Canada's knowledge of the Arctic and strengthening Canadian leadership in polar science and technology. The reprofiled funding requested through these supplementary estimates is required for the construction and other anticipated expenses to close out the construction contract, including those related to the Inuit Benefits Agreement and the extension of the duration of the contract. The outcome of the investments in post-secondary education and in the Canadian High Arctic Research Station project will undoubtedly help Northerners close the gaps in educational outcomes, provide ongoing learning and skills and technology. The supplementary estimates also reflect $10.9 million of reprofiled funding for Phase 3 of the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, It is the government's priority to protect
We're
the health
losing,
and environment.
Min-
Can you hear me? It is the government's priority
Now we can hear you.
to effective and consistent manner to reduce and eliminate, where possible, risks to human and environmental health and the liability associated with contaminated sites. Le COVID-19 continue d'affecter nos vies au quotidien et les habitants.
COVID-19 continues to affect our daily lives. Items. Earlier this year, our government provided additional investments to Nutrition North Canada to increase the federal subsidy rate in all eligible communities. In addition, we also implemented the Harvesters Support Grant, co-developed with Indigenous partners to increase access to country foods across the North and the Arctic. By providing additional subsidies and helping with the costs associated with hunting and harvesting, residents of isolated communities will be better able to afford to feed and protect themselves and their family. We've provided supports to maintain critical air supply routes, funding for testing and contact tracing, sick leave, income supports for individuals, and support for businesses. Thank you so much for the time that you've given me today. And it is with pleasure that I will now answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Vandal. A couple of things. I had a little bit of a freeze on my end. Vice Chair McLeod, be ready at any time, such as you did at our last meeting. Secondly, we will be voting on the SUPs following the rounds of questioning. Kathy McLeod, you are up first for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ministers. Whole number of questions, but there's something that came to my attention this morning, and I do actually want to follow up on this particular issue. As we know, as we have these settlements, as we resolve these long-term injustices, there are other people, like from Caribou Prince George has worked through your office, and in August was promised a phone call from and a conversation with the number of tourist operators who in many cases are from the Honeyquatin, indicating that they will not continue with the permit that he has to run his business. So essentially, his business is over, and it's a huge issue. So again, I know that we have to solve these issues long-standing. So will the minister commit today not only to following through with that phone call that I understand her staff committed to, but also working with the province to see if we can sort of ease the transition for the people that have been impacted by a significant decision? Thank you.
Briefly, please, Minister, because I hope we'll get back to the SUPs, which is before us. Minister, go ahead.
Absolutely. Kathy and I know I have spoken to your colleague on a number of occasions, and again, this that it is really to seeing what I can do to really promote the kind of understanding that comes with again those leases and the title rights.
Kathy?
So in terms of specific land claims, and I do acknowledge it's a bit of a challenge. You see the estimates and the moving of money, and I understand that. And then you go to your department to different documents, and you end up with, in actual fact, there's been so many solved, but there's actually many out there that are not even accepted for discussion yet. So I guess my question is when you put a numerator and a denominator of 75% resolution of specific land claims, could you describe?
Well, I think it's really important, Kathy, that the work that we are doing with the FN now to change the specific claims process, it's been completely frustrating. There was a way in the past where people would wait 3 different way with joint research, with a way of moving forward to settle these claims. That if harm was done, then we want to work together on that. And There's many claims. Some of them are clumped, Kathy, and that's good. Like
no,
the
but,
agricultural claims.
Minister, I guess when your department claims that they have solved 75% of the specific land claims, which is in your 2018, 2019 departmental review, I think it's reasonable to say what is a numerator, what is a denominator.
Sure. And I think what we are trying to do is to settle those claims so they don't have to go to the tribunal. And that means we have to listen to one another and do the research together.
Okay, so thank you. So I guess if we look at departmental reports, then it sounds like you recognize there is a flawed process that you're trying to fix, but to sort of claim that, you know, you're 75% successful in the work that you're trying to do. So this sort of aligns with my first question, which talks about other impacted parties. So with the Wet'suwet'en, you went to the territory and you met with the hereditary chiefs, and of course it would be like going to the Senate and talking to the Senate about a resolution of an issue without bothering to talk to the House Committee where that conversation is at, because I understand that there is, in spite of COVID, there is still some significant challenges with the Wet'suwet'en and the Coastal GasLink and what's going to happen next.
Well, as you know, Kathy, the Supreme Court decision in Delgamuukw was with the hereditary leadership. And so that is where we needed to go to resolve the issue. There is
Minister,
no question.
I'm sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt. We're running out of time. We have an 8:30 cold start. Perhaps you could communicate the rest of the answer, at least for 6 minutes, and I'm sorry for that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, thank you for appearing before us. And I agree with you that accelerating self-determination is the best way to support Indigenous communities and people. From education and health outcomes to economic development, we know that Indigenous communities achieve the best results when they assert their jurisdiction and chart their own path on these critical issues. Can you expand on the $28.6 million requested through these estimates for recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination tables? Also, how will this funding help support communities assuming greater control of their communities for their people?
Thank you so much, Jaime, and we thank you for your career of work, having all Canadians understand the importance of arrangements with First Nations. We know that there are better health education outcomes when First Nations, Inuit, and Métis are in charge of those decisions, as in you lived in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq, that from 30% finishing high school to 95% when the Mi'kmaq were in charge of their education system, the results speak for themselves. And so it's really important now that in the past, those agreements were very fixed, that the minister would have a mandate, they'd go to the community, they'd say, you know, it's take it or leave it, see you in a court. And instead, we've moved to a very flexible system where communities are able to choose what area, and now they are moving on to their full governance agreement, having had their Education Act passed. So it is, I think, at all of these tables, Child and Family Services, Children Home. And so I think this new flexible approach that also no cede and surrender, no extinguishment of rights, and no longer based on loans, that we would have, negotiations that would be 20 years and the nation would be $30 million in debt. That's over as we move forward to a much better way of doing this.
That's great to hear, Minister. And you know what, I think I agree with you 100% when you talk about flexibility is an important thing. I just want you to reiterate one thing that you said there, is that we're, as a Canadian government, we are what our government is doing out there, for people calling us these tables termination tables of treaties and things like that. Can you can you comment on that a bit?
Absolutely. And I think that the proof was that when we were able to sign the agreement with British Columbia a year ago, August, and there it was very clear that this would be the new way of going forward. That really was in the collaborative fiscal arrangement that we're doing with the already self-governing nations, that they work with Canada to figure out what funding they need in order to be able to run their governments. And I think these two things alone, I think, have made a huge difference in people understanding that getting out from like the Anishinaabe Nation or Kanaha, that this is a way that they can come together in geography, language, numbered treaty, however they want to form a governance based on the consensus of their people and their traditional laws, legal customs, that this, it's an exciting time, Jaime, and thank you for all your work on it.
How can the new recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination tables provide an effective way for communities to move beyond the outdated and colonial structures of that Indian Act?
Well, I think that it's, it is a matter of the Indian Act bands and the hereditary leadership coming together in their communities to work on a governance of their choosing, that becomes the partner nation to nation with Canada and determining their future and describing their relationship with Canada, and the celebration of getting out from under the Indian Act, as I remember signing at Slamin and others, that the pregnant moms beaming that their baby would be born not under the Indian Act.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much. We're right at time, Jaime.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Madame Bérubé, s'il vous plaît, 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you appear before the committee. My question is for Minister Bennett. When C5 will be passed and will... I hope this holiday, and that it not just be a holiday for federal workers. Once again, Bill, C5, C5. I don't think it's part of the supplementary estimates. Perhaps one of the civil servants could answer.
Bill is presented to the House by the Minister of Canadian
Point
Heritage.
Sorry. This bill, in it, that is responsible for this. Thank you. My other question is for Minister Bennett as well. When we're talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we know that last year your government declared that a national plan would be published in June 2020. In May 2020, the government has pushed back this plan. So what has been done? This is a very important question. We are fully supportive of the families and loved ones of all those who have on this. We worked with the provinces and territories. This was the first national investigation that was done with their own individual plans in partnership with families and survivors in order to have an action plan for each province and territory. But also there is a broader national plan . So now, Mrs. Bérubé, I think that with the leadership of Gina Wilson and the Deputy Minister of Yukon, we are working every day in order to come up with an accountability plan in order to make sure that results are obtained. So when we talk about murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls and measures that you undertook to implement political, economic, and social rights of women, girls, and Indigenous peoples. We have a website with all the efforts being made by all departments from the federal government, public safety, Indigenous services, and also the status of women. It's extremely important to have a complete plan very soon, and to ensure transparency and accountability for all the families, survivors, and Canadians. When we also talk about the recognition of Indigenous rights and rights to self-determination, yes, these tables on self-determination is a new approach. Communities will determine their own priorities, and and a flexible timeline. And also, there will be a negotiation, and afterwards, ratification with their communities.
Eh bien, English. Ms. Blaney, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both ministers for being here. If I could start with you, Minister Vandal. As you well know, that Nunavut is now in its official lockdown, and we've heard to deal with this reality. We know, and what we're hearing from the communities is that people are not only concerned about COVID, but also their mental health. I'm just wondering if you could talk to us about what your government is doing to keep everyone physically and mentally safe.
Going on in Nunavut right now. We had a call this morning, actually, as we do most mornings, between myself, Minister Bennett, and Minister Miller, and public health officials to get the latest information on what is occurring in Nunavut. Keep the virus out, and it's just unfortunate that it actually appears that perhaps the virus came up from the city I'm in, Winnipeg, which is one of the isolation hubs, and Manitoba is going through a huge crisis in and of itself. I do know at the public health level, our federal public health officers are in constant conversation with Nunavut public health officers, and they're talking about supports for contact tracing, testing, rapid response teams. I do know that we are also talking to the government of Nunavut delivery, as well as perhaps some more resources to making sure that the fuel gets to where it needs to be. Food insecurity is always a huge issue in Nunavut, as we all know, and I know that that our government and Inuit governments to talk about how we can provide them more support to address the food insecurity issues. So on so many different levels, the public health level, I have spoken to, we're engaged at all the levels that we need to be to provide the support to Nunavut that they need. And we are going to be there for Nunavut throughout this crisis.
Thank you. My next question is around the Universal Broadband Fund. Set aside for the satellite capabilities for the most northern, rural and remote communities where it's simply, as you well know, not feasible to connect to fiber. I'm just wondering, how is your department working with them to make sure that this gets done? Because we know that they need access to employment, education, and health services right now during the pandemic, and of course, even before. But that urgency is...
Us is that the importance of connectivity is going to be even more important post-pandemic. The connectivity limitations have been raised for a long time, and they have far-reaching impacts. Many communities rely exclusively on satellite for access to internet services. They lack access to fast, high-quality, and reliable telecommunication networks. That's why, actually, the numbers we recently announced are $750 million on top of the $1 billion that was announced in budget. 28% of Canadians across the country by 2026, with the goal of connecting all Canadians by the year 2030. I can tell you that I'm working with Minister Monsef to engage the government of Nunavut as well as private stakeholders in how to access this fund. We know that things get even a little more difficult the further north you go. I think there's a capacity there for, or a potential for low Earth orbit satellite capacity. So we are engaging. This money was recently announced last week, I believe, and we are in the middle of the pandemic. And I can tell you that Nunavut has actually and will be even more important post-pandemic.
Thank you. So I only have a few seconds, but I just want to come to you, Minister Bennett. Part of what you're committing to, of course, is implementing the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to action. I'm just going to bring again from my writing, there's the Little Red Dress Project where they are actually fundraising to put up billboards. And I'm just wondering, will there be any support for these kind of organizations that are desperately trying to find their missing women and girls?
Just 10 seconds. I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
Absolutely. We felt that the commemoration funding and Minister Monsef's been very working hard at that, and exactly we know that this is important to communities, and that is part of the healing.
Thank you so much. And now,
and I'd like to direct my questions to Minister Vandal. And Minister, you mentioned in your remarks that the estimates show your government's commitment to economic development, and the proposed Alberta to Alaska rail line is something that we know will be able to generate billions of dollars in economic activity across northern Canada. And the project has recently received a presidential border crossing permit from the United States. I'm wondering if you can confirm whether your government is supportive of the project, or if the Prime Minister intends to block it in a similar way that he has with other similar development projects.
Well, I can tell you that that is something that is extremely intriguing, and I do know that our government has yet to see an actual proposal from anyone on this potentially very exciting project. We know that connectivity, whether it's physical or virtual, is something that we need more of in the north. We've recently launched Canada's largest ever infrastructure program to help develop projects
Minister.
in the north. When we get an actual proposal, we'll actually do the review of it.
Thank you.
Is a short answer.
Yeah, and I would like to comment on the broadband as well. And I realize it is not exclusively in your file, but definitely something that's very important to many people across the north. And the government is currently planning to connect all communities across Canada by 2030. And I believe that for many in the north, I'm sure, Minister, you'd agree that that timeline is still too long. And the official opposition, we actually brought forward a plan of our own to help connect Canadians. It's a plan that includes changes to spectrum auctions, incentives for rural infrastructure, new rules to prevent big companies from profiting off of consumers. And we believe that these suggestions could help accelerate that timeline. And they're public, they're out there. So I guess my question, Minister, would be if you have any thoughts on why the government hasn't taken some of those great suggestions.
Well, I think our government's very clear that we think suggestions are useful, but we need some actual dollars to come forward to work with territorial governments, to work with private companies, to work with satellite companies. And that's why last week the Prime Minister announced $750 million on top of the $1 billion announced in the previous budget to connect Canadians to high-speed internet across Canada. We want to grow businesses. We want to create jobs. We also, Prime Minister recently announced an agreement of $600 million with Canadian satellite company Telsat to improve connectivity and expand high-speed internet coverage to the far north, the rural areas, to remote regions across Canada.
Thank you, Minister.
Through low Earth orbit satellite capacity.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask a bit about housing as well. And Minister, again, we've had some conversations about housing, and you know there's a housing crisis across the north, to put it frankly. And with the recent rapid housing initiative that was announced, I know there were some people in my riding that were I don't know if concerned is the right word, but they had some questions about why there was certain urban centers that were prioritized through the first stream of funding, and I believe that stream of funding to ensure that northern communities can have access to a lot of this funds and aren't in any way left behind would be beneficial. Could you speak to why the government didn't seem to consider that?
1 minute.
Well, I can tell you that improving housing outcomes is an absolute priority for our government. And I can tell you in all of my travels and phone calls and Zoom calls, both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, housing comes up the most often. And we realize it's even more important during a pandemic. Our government, I know, has a 10-year housing agreement with the government of Nunavut. In fact, we have 10-year housing agreements with the territorial governments in Northwest Territory and the Yukon, which will invest close to $800 million in those three territories. As well, we have a 10-year, $400 million housing agreement with Inuit land claim organizations that are going to invest close to $400 million in Inuit housing. We feel we're going in the right direction, but you're absolutely right. The gaps are so large. There's so much work to do that we need to continue what we're doing for many, many years.
Thanks very much, Minister. And Mr. Van Couverden, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm running from my home and traditional territory, the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. I just wanted to say thank you to both ministers and staff for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here. And I just also wanted to give a shout out to my friend and colleague, MP Baptiste, whose insight, perspective, and knowledge on issues like this are just so valuable to this committee. And if our friend and colleague Mumalak Kakak were here, I'd say the same about her perspective. No offense, MP Blaney, you're wonderful, and it's great to be working with you here. But I know I speak for all of us on this committee when Absolutely. I say that we miss Mumalak and we wish her well. My questions are for you, Minister Vandal, and I'd like to focus on something that wasn't touched on too much in your speech, but I heard it. I think I heard sure that we're getting them the services that they need. I also know that you and your youth, and probably still, were a great athlete, and you know that athletics and sport has a really positive impact on youth. I talked to a good friend yesterday, named Becky Scott, who has a program called Spirit North, which brings endurance sports to a lot of Indigenous youth across the country. 6,300 last year, actually. It's great numbers. So if you could elaborate a little bit on the post-secondary program.
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me set a little bit of the context. Something that was signed on prior to the last election is the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. Minister Bennett did a tremendous amount of work on it. And it's a framework whereby the territorial governments, the Indigenous nations are all signed on to, as well as several provinces, including Saskatchewan, Manitoba, as well as Ontario and Quebec, I believe. That is a policy framework where all the leadership in the North sits at the same table to hammer out priorities. One of those priorities is education. And one of the ideas that came out of there was to let's form a task force with the best and the brightest of the North and look at the post-secondary education systems and consult with people that work in the sector, consult with other leaders, look at traditional Indigenous knowledge, and make recommendations to our government on how we can improve. So we reached out. We reached out to those people that are on the framework, the territorial governments, the Indigenous nations, the Inuit leadership, the First Nation and Métis leadership of the North, and they've submitted names, several names actually, that we were able to choose from to put on the task force. So their work has started last week. In fact, I had my first meeting with, they're such a dynamic group. It's a good mix of experience and youth, Indigenous and not. And they're going out there and they're going to submit a report to government by, I believe it's March of 2021. So it's not a lot of time. So they have a lot of work to do. And that's something that is important to our government. The initiative started before the last election. We've invested over $40 million in 5 years to improve post-secondary options in the North. And this is something that is exciting, and I hope is going to bear a lot of fruit in the future.
1 minute, Adam.
Thank you very much, Minister Vandal. And I just have one more question. And in it, if you could elaborate a little bit on the value and the leverage potential that I think a connection to natural environment through sport, play, and recreation might be able to provide through that program with the post-secondary task force. And as well, if you could elaborate a little bit on the food program and how access to post-secondary education and the food program are connected.
It's less than 30 seconds for those answers.
Yeah, absolutely. We all know the value of sport, of recreation in young people. Something that I don't think that's been looked at often enough is the value of Indigenous sport. And I know that's going to be something that comes up in the task force's work. So we're looking forward to them giving us suggestions. But we know there's a lot of work to do. Once the report comes in, that's when the actual work must continue, and we're committed to doing it.
We're over time on that, but thank you for that answer. Madam Berube, you have 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
I'm asking this question because in your budget, you're saying $82 million for mental health for Indigenous populations. We know that mental health is extremely important. There are mental health issues, there are high suicides rate. How are you going to assess this budget with COVID-19 and what's going on? Is this for me? Yes. We know that COVID-19 is an extremely difficult time for everyone. And there will be many mental health needs. My department is working closely with the department, with Mr. Miller's department. And we're working closely with the leadership of the Indigenous communities to make sure that we're able to provide services that are culturally sensitive, that are sensitive to Indigenous traditions, and that will benefit all going forward. You also, when we talk about mental health, you talked about resources and the needs. You've assessed resources and needs, and this is in your forecast, I would imagine? Yes, this is something that's extremely important for the North. It's important throughout Canada. But this is an initiative that falls under the responsibility of Canada Indigenous Services. It's the department of Minister Miller. But we work together very closely, and we know that it's something so important that we do need to work together. Minister Miller and his department are taking the lead on this issue. We also hear about child and family services and the Jordan Principle. Have you undertaken any measures to make sure that services be provided and that are not curtailed due to COVID-19? Yes. It's hard to explain this in 10 seconds, but I can say that this is something that falls under Mr. Miller's department.
With that, go to Ms. Blaney for 2.5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Chair. Minister Bennett, if I could come to you. I've recently had a meeting with some representatives from Catastrophe, and I understand that they have met with your government not too long ago. And of course, those meaningful conversations in the community on how to move forward in the best possible way. As you know, that is not happening. My department going to do anything to support these very important discussions. When we talk about moving forward and looking at self-determination, these are key parts. And one of the things that deeply concerns me is so often these projects happen, continue to happen, even when communities come forward and say, we need the time to have that meaningful conversation internally before this project moves forward. So I'm just wondering if you could update this committee on those commitments.
It's a really important question as we move forward to self-determination and determining governance within communities where there have been elected leadership as well as hereditary leadership, and how do communities come together to take decisions together as a community. In most of those land decisions, the decisions around land are provincial decisions, and it is it's difficult, but we want to support those conversations within communities so that they can take decisions together, and that's what we're trying to do with provinces and territories and with communities.
So right now what we're seeing though is this conversation is being undermined fundamentally because the progress is continuing, the project is continuing. So can you commit that you'll work with the provincial government to actually honor the First People's right to self-determination in that place?
15 seconds.
These are ongoing conversations that we had with the previous minister, and we will begin with the new Minister of Indigenous Affairs, this is the complicated in that we as the federal government don't have responsibility around the land, but we do have responsibility to do whatever we can to promote those kinds of important conversations within community to determine their own governance and how they take decisions.
Thanks very much, Minister. And I know that you have to leave us immediately for another meeting. And Minister Vandal, thank you as well, plus the staffers who joined us, the senior people. Thank you for joining us. And committee, I apologize for having to brusquely truncate the questioning period, but we are at the point now with regard to the estimates, and I would like to ask if I have unanimous consent to call the votes as a group and adopt on division. Thumbs up, any thumbs down? I see, I believe we have unanimous consent to adopt on division. The estimates, I'm okay, good. I can't quite see everybody because I can't see the room, but I am told that we're okay. So thank you very much. On division, we have passed unanimously the subs, and now having adopted the supplementary estimates, I must now ask the committee, shall I report the supplementary estimates B 2020-21 to the House? Thumbs up. I believe I have unanimous consent once again. So that is agreed. And once again, thank you to all. These are tough meetings, but I appreciate the spirit in which they're conducted. And thanks once again to our ministers and staff. This meeting is now adjourned.